Prior to the 1930s, the meaning of hobo is basically anyone who wandered the country in search of work. Although before hobo became commonplace, there was another name everyone knew them by. After the first major economic crisis of America in 1873, many Civil War veterans who traveled by railways, looking for work anywhere across the nation, were known as tramps. The exact time frame when the word hobo emerged in American English publications was around the year 1890, but the origin of the word is under much dispute. At this point in history, hobos weren't given much media attention and most people didn't know that they existed, despite their sizable presence. This all gradually changed after October 29, 1929, otherwise known as Black Tuesday. This was the day the world witnessed the worst stock market crash ever. To make matters worse for the general public, the stock market was still a relatively new playing field. As a result, a significant amount of people, including the working class, middle class, and even upper class, invested the majority of their monetary possessions into this new, seemingly secure, capitalistic machine. When the stock market crashed, people lost their life savings from banks which had shut down due to the financial crisis. Most people at the time trusted banks and kept their money in an account, so when it vanished, all they had left was the meager pocket change and spending money they held on hand or at home. Of course, they had an income, their jobs, more than likely a common white-collar occupation that was on the rise at the time. But then companies were also affected by this, for when they became tight on money or simply bankrupt, they had to cut workers. When people were relieved of their occupations, there was no income for them and their families. With nothing to support oneself or family with, these people quickly fell into debt. With absolutely no way to pay off debt, they had to mortgage their houses. Unfortunately, due to the failure of the banking system which caused an immense decrease in home loans, they could not even pay off their monthly payments. Eventually, these people lost their homes to foreclosure. In turn, a good portion of these former workers came to be hobos. During the Great Depression, over 250,000 young men left their homes in hope and desperation to search for jobs. Most of these young men were around the ages of 16 to 25. With the thousands of businesses that failed and the scores of schools that closed, jobs in reality were unavailable to this wandering young generation. If hobos weren't looking for jobs to support their families, which a great deal of them were, they left home to escape poverty, abusive families, or simply for the thrill of adventure. These drifters often found work at farms where they picked fruit and vegetables, while others traveled across the country in search of jobs at construction, mining, timber, and agricultural industries. In 1935, the Civilian Conservation Corps provided employment for more than 500,000 young men. The program was set up not only to provide jobs for the unemployed, but also to relieve the male heads of the household who struggled to find jobs during the Great Depression. During this time, hobos were also employed under the Works Progress Administration, a New Deal agency, to work in public projects such as constructing public buildings and roads. These New Deal programs helped some hobos find work when all other options were gone. The hobos who didn't manage to find employment in either the Civilian Conservation Corps or the Works Progress Administration would settle down in hobo camps, local shelters, or labor fields. In the Midwest, hobos stayed in cities in order to find refuge from the harsh winters. Those that lived in plains farther west often stayed in giant hobo camps, where they would find some refuge amongst themselves, along the railroad tracks. Yet other hobos, the luckier ones, found places to sleep indoors, like in churches and Salvation Army facilities. Before the U.S. set up its welfare system in 1935, Christian organizations provided tramps and hobos with shelter, food, and clothing, if they agreed to work for their food and sit through sermons. While some hobos stayed in these rescue missions and city shelters, others found refuge in free public flop houses, also known as lodging houses. In 1935, the Civilian Conservation Corps replaced some of these organizations by setting up over 2,650 camps to provide hobos with sleeping quarters, meals, and clothing. Hobos lived in poor conditions no matter where they were. Some jungles were crowded with both hobos and tramps from across the country. For example, in one of the hobo centers of the West, Lower Douglas Street in Omaha, Nebraska, was where Omaha's bums came to hang out. These hobo jungles were slum-like. For example, in a photograph taken by Arthur Rothstein in St. Louis, Missouri, there is a hobo jungle alongside the city's riverfront, depicting the hobo slums full of rubble, dirt, scraps, and old cloth. While some hobos gathered in slums, others woke up in old blankets and clothes from their beds in unusual areas, such as alongside a corral. Conditions were worse when concerning food, since many people were starving during the Depression. People would wait in long lines for bread and soup given by charity organizations, while others rummaged through gutters and garbage dumps looking for scraps of food. In a photograph captured by John Bacon, there is a man skinning a turtle to make a soup in a hobo jungle. an area off a railroad where hobos would camp and congregate. This savage depiction of survival showed some of the poorest conditions of living as a hobo.
During the 30s, hitchhiking was the legal and slightly safer form of transportation for hobos. Although hitchhiking had existed prior to the 30s, the numbers of hitchhikers rose greatly during the Great Depression. In response to the popularity of hitchhiking, the New Deal set up a transient bureau in 1933 to operate 300 centers around the nation to aid hitchhikers and hobos. The bureau provided these transients with food and shelter and set up large transient camps on the outskirts of cities. While some hobos hitchhiked, others stole a ride by hopping a freight train, the most common method of transportation at the time. In 1932, as the Depression worsened, President Herbert Hoover created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which provided emergency loans to banks, utilities, and railroads. This allowed trains to keep running so they remained to be the hobos' main source of transportation. Every day, about 1,500 transients hopped these freight trains to look for work. While they were on the road, these drifters hiked in search of a place to sleep or for food to eat. Hopping freight trains was very dangerous and constantly led to trouble with the authorities. More than 6,500 hobos were killed annually, either by accidents involving railroads or by railroad bulls, brutal guards hired by the railroads to make sure that the trains carried only paying customers. Most hobos risked this by hiding underneath the train. When boarding a train, hobos would run alongside the train, reach up, grab the hatch, and like Tarzan, swing up to the inside of the car. As the train would reach its destination, they would have to quickly hop off before a new set of bulls could come to arrest or beat them. In the process, some missed the train and many lost their legs or their lives. To cope with these daily hardships, hobos developed a system of symbols to communicate with one another. Hoboglyphs were a very large set of signs in which each one represented a very different circumstance or item. For example, a glyph with a semicircle with a dot right below it meant that bulls were active. Another glyph that depicted a stick figure with a bell bottom alongside one large triangle and 3 regular triangles in the background meant a kind woman lives here. Most of these symbols were easy marks, signs that were used to identify a person or place where a hobo could get food and a place to stay overnight. To the common person, these glyphs were undecipherable. With this advantage, hobos developed an exclusive method of surviving their daily struggles among others in the Brotherhood. During the Great Depression, writers, photographers, songwriters, and filmmakers brought the travels and hardships of hobos to light. To document the economic ailments that spearheaded to the Great Depression, the U.S. government appointed a group of photographers from the Information Division of the Farm Security Administration. These photographers, such as Gordon Parks, John Vachon, and Walker Evans, captured the dismal moments of hobos from 1935 to 1943. In the beginning of the 1930s, the media celebrated hobos for their love of freedom and adventure on the road. Many confined their wanderings to wide open spaces, since they were known to be traveling alongside roads, thus illustrating their association with independence and thrill in their travels. However, Depression-era accounts of tramping and hobos soon emphasized not the romance of freedom and adventure, but the bleak reality of life of the American hobo. There were various films in the 1930s that portrayed hobos as vagrant, homeless people who encounter adversities throughout their journeys. One noteworthy portrayal of hobos was Warner Bros. Studios' Wild Boys of the Road, a film about 2 teenage boys, Tommy Gordon and Eddie Smith, who both left their homes and looked for jobs to ease the burden on their families due to the economic afflictions of the Great Depression. Warner Bros. Studios produced this movie to prevent young people from riding the rails, since hopping on freight trains was common for hobos at the time. Warner Bros. Studios sent their message by displaying the hardships that Tommy and Eddie go through in their journey, such as when Tommy's leg was being mangled by an oncoming train, and when they were living in Sewer Pipe City before getting ousted by city authorities. The 1939 cartoon Hobo Gadget Band, also created by the Warner Bros. Studio, was about a traveling group of hobos who applied for jobs as amateur musicians for a radio station. After their performance, the hobos were praised by the broadcaster and were given the opportunity to live a luxurious life and no longer live as hobos. However, they declined the offer and rushed out to catch the next train, still feeling the life as a hobo. Hobo Gadget Band was a cartoon that pictured hobos with the falsehood of spirit of freedom and adventure, while Wild Boys of the Road displayed the dismal reality of the hobo life. Both Wild Boys of the Road and Hobo Gadget Band illustrated hobos as homeless and wandering people who were looking for jobs. This depiction of hobo life was tested in the 1997 documentary Riding the Rails, which offered perspectives from teenage hobos on the presumed romanticism of traveling on the railroad during the Great Depression. The film dispelled the romantic myths of a hobo's life and its mask of freedom and adventure, recalling painful experiences of now elderly survivors of the rails. These survivors remembered miserable memories such as homesickness, being suffocated by train smoke, not knowing where and if they could find jobs, sleeping in jails, and avoiding bulls. Renee Champion, one of the survivors, recalled the lonely feeling he felt when traveling in wide open spaces, asserting that some of the worst feelings of loneliness that he has ever experienced in his life were in situations like this. Through accounts of a hobo's methods for survival and accounts of somber miseries, melancholies, imprisonments, deaths, and dispossessions, Riding the Rails uncovered the true portrayal of the Great Depression's hobos, wanderers who were forced to travel more by economic urgency, food, and work than the romantic spirit of adventure. After the stock market crash of 1929 sent a great deal of Americans out of work, people drastically changed their lives to survive the financial crisis. They became a genuine testament of American culture, hardworking, independent, and determined. In the beginning of the Great Depression, hobos came about because there was a scarcity of employment and they needed to search for jobs to support themselves and their families. So these hobos traveled by trains in search of work and hoped to find food and shelter along the way. With their employment in the CCC and WPA, these hobos built up the nation's infrastructures and contributed significantly in progressing society. From their hardships to their survival to their several contributions to society, hobos created a culture that defined America and its brutal reality during the 1930s.